The very famous quote from President Lincoln is, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time."
Hey, everybody. Hello, hello. Welcome to the GAR Museum presentation. We have an exciting one today. At least I'm interested in this subject because I know McClellan. I probably know the greatest hits and the stuff that we all see on the, front page kind of stuff. And I like the idea of maybe getting into it a little bit more. So this is pretty exciting for us. Uh, Kathleen Sharaf is a professor at LaSalle University whose historical research has centered around anti-heroes and villains. She's a member of the Grand Army of the Republic Civil War Museum Board and a member of the Delaware Valley Civil War Roundtable, where she has presented educational programs. And it's so great to have her come, and we want to see what she has to say about George B. McClellan. So if there's anything else you'd like to add, I'm going to let you take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And as mentioned before, I like controversial topics, as particular people in the Civil War. I did George Armstrong Custer earlier this year for Del Val. I did James Longstreet. So I wanted to really end the year with someone very interesting, and that's George B. McClellan, who is someone who makes people's blood boil. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about the man. Now, everyone has probably seen Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, and you really just, McClellan can put a bad taste in your mouth. But I did want to understand why everyone thought he was such a great idea. What was his background? Why did the men love him? His relationship with Lincoln, which was not very good. So we will take a deep dive into the man who helped whip the Army of the Potomac into shape, George B. McClellan, and we will discuss his actions, and his hesitations. So McClellan is a Philadelphia boy. He's a Philadelphia native, a Pennsylvania native. He was born December 3rd, 1826, right here in Philadelphia. His father was a very wealthy and well-known physician in Philadelphia. His father actually started and was a founder of the Jefferson Medical College, which is now, Jefferson Hospital and Jefferson University in Philadelphia. So he comes from a very, well-to-do family, very well-respected, very old family in Philadelphia. But McClellan was a wonderkind. He was very, very intelligent as a child. He started the University of Pennsylvania at the age of 13 and then transferred over at the age of 15 to West Point, where he, honed a lot of his skills that he would use, later in his life. So he transferred at the age of 15, where he academically excelled. He did very, very well there, and he graduated second in his class in 1846 at the age of 19. And like many other Northern and Southerners, in the Civil War who went to West Point, he forged a lot of friendships. He forged a lot of friendships with Southerners, such as George Pickett and A.P. Hill. And being friends with people like that really formed a different perspective for him. And he had an appreciation and understanding of the Southern way of life. So that, in a way, influences his actions during the American Civil War. But he was very good friends with two men who later became very big generals for the Confederacy. So his early military career, after graduating West Point, McClellan was actually commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. So he performed like recon missions for Major General Winfield Scott, who was ironically a very close friend of McClellan's father. So already right there, his childhood connections are already working to his advantage. So McClellan's experience in the war, would shape his, military and political outlook. He military strategy wise learned about flanking movements and how they were often better than frontal assaults. And then he understood the value of a siege, which would come in handy, in Richmond later on. So he learned a lot from Winfield Scott. He witnessed how Scott was both a good military leader and also a very good politician. Scott was able to forge very good relationships with people that they were invading, the civilian populations that they were invading. Instead of trying to be seen as a hostile force, he, tried to make people see that we aren't the bad guys. We're here to help you. And Scott also emphasized discipline among the soldiers, how you don't just go and start damaging people's property. Respect the people, have discipline, and try to minimize property damage. So these are little things that are seem a little insignificant at the time, but become very significant throughout the war because behavior and discipline is very, very big for McClellan, and that's something he emphasizes as he takes command later on during the Civil War. But McClellan also had a disdain for volunteer soldiers, which is ironic because most of the soldiers in the Civil War were volunteers. But he really didn't respect them because he is a West Point graduate. He says graduates from West Points are real soldiers. They go through the military training, they go through schooling, so they're the best of the best. And he's not wrong, but there is a use for, for the volunteer, which is ironic because he has to train volunteer soldiers when he takes command. So he served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, participating in several key battles and earning brevet promotions for his bravery. So he was known for his bravery during some of his exploits during this time. And after the war, McClellan worked on engineering projects, including fortifications and railroad surveys. So he has a very analytical mind, and he's very book smart. And he's someone who seems to be very appealing because he can understand strategy. So during that time, he also was an instructor at West Point. So he was teaching at West Point, and then he took a sabbatical and went to Europe to study the military tactics of the Crimean War. And this broadened his strategies, and he learned a lot during that time. He even wrote so much that some of his reports about the Crimean War are published later on. So he understands tactics, and he even wrote a manual on, bayonet and cavalry tactics. And he designed the McClellan salad, which is something that is actually used today, more for ceremonial purposes. But this was used as long as the cavalry was big. It was used during the Civil War, and in post Reconstruction up until the cavalry was no longer used anymore. So he contributed a lot just with the McClellan saddle to military tactics. He resigned from the army in 1857, and then he pursued a career in the rapidly expanding railroad industry, which is a very lucrative industry at the time because the country was continuing to grow. So he became like the chief engineer and later president of the Illinois Central Railroad, and then he worked with the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. So this helped during the Civil War when logistics was very big. Um, but despite his lucrative career, he just grew very frustrated with civilian life. He wasn't happy. He liked being a soldier. He liked the military strategy. So while he resigned from the army and while he was working as an executive, he still kept up on military tactics, and still try to keep his skills fresh. So his time in the railroad business, logistic skills, management skills, and large scale organization skills, which would be very invaluable during the Civil War. So his connections in the military and also in the business world, because he was a very powerful man at the time, working with railroads, really helped him influence certain people and helped his reputation outside and inside of the military. So the Civil War begins and McClellan rises to command. So at the start of the Civil War in 1861, McClellan's knowledge of what was called the Big War science and his railroad experience suggested he might excel at military logistics. So this is one aspect of his personality I really wondered. I'm like, well, he became such a disaster. Why did people think he was a good idea? Because he was very book smart. And he understood logistics and he wrote manuals on bayonets and he created a saddle. So people thought he would be a very good idea. And he graduated number two at West Point. You don't graduate number two at West Point if you don't get good grades and if you don't work very hard. So, his reputation from the Mexican-American War and then his reputation as an executive made him very, very appealing. And he had organizational skills and management skills and large-scale operation skills. So he seemed very, very, seemed very accomplished and a good choice at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, he went to Europe for several years to study the Crimean War. And as I mentioned, his reports were published. So that made him someone who was very in demand by the Union Army, as it was organizing militias and armies because he understood tactics from around the world, not just in the United States. Now, they studied Napoleonic tactics a lot at West Point, but he himself went to Europe and saw fighting there. So people are like, oh, he has such great experience, not even just as a soldier in America, but as someone who observed fighting in Europe. That would be very good. That could be very helpful to us as the South secedes. So there is an outbreak of a civil war, obviously, in 1861, and McClellan was appointed Major General of the Ohio Volunteers. Now, this is a funny story because, as a Pennsylvania man, he wanted to command Pennsylvania. However, the Ohio governor got to him first before the Pennsylvania governor. Now, the Pennsylvania governor did want him to take command, but he was just too slow. That's how much in demand McClellan was. Governors of different Union states wanted him to run their military. So he had early successes, in Western Virginia. It brought him to national attention. And after the Union defeat at the first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as the South calls it, he was called to Washington to take command of the Army of the Potomac. So he is very loved by the soldiers. He really is. He earns the nickname the Young Napoleon. And as you can see, just the way he's standing here, all the men around him, all the men admiring him, people being happy to be in a photo with him. He was handsome. He was young. He was only 34 years old. He had a West Point education. He came from a very good family. And he was very charismatic. And he cared for his soldiers. So he didn't want unnecessary bloodshed. No one wants to be called a butcher. Grant, later on when he takes over in 1864 is called a butcher. Lincoln is called a butcher, for the slaughter and the death that comes, and he didn't want that. And I can respect him for that, but also wanting to save lives, but also not being able to do anything to help win a war is very conflicting, especially when you're commanding, a very big army. So, the young Napoleon um, is a nickname given to him, and he loves it. The way he poses, he loves the camera, he loves the attention. A little bit of his ego is getting inflated at this point. So you can see we will touch later on how that becomes a little bit of a problem. So the organizer of the Army of the Potomac. So McClellan's greatest achievement, if there was one thing we can say about him that is positive, it is that he transformed this ragtag group of volunteers, and he hated volunteers. He turned them into effective fighting force. And this is something that he learned from his time under General Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War. And he implemented rigorous training. Because he understood railroads and the logistics, he improved supply systems. And he boosted morale because the men absolutely loved him. A lot of the men had undying loyalty to him, even after he was kicked out and even after the war was over. Someone like George Armstrong Custer, who's very close to McClellan early in his career, and for the rest of his life remained very close to McClellan. That's the kinds of relationships that he forged. But the Union was really getting beaten up by the Southern Rebellion militia. They didn't even have railroads that functioned properly. A lot of them didn't have uniforms that looked the same, but they're really getting beaten up. So he was able to drill them and turn them into a fighting force, which is what you need to obviously win a war. So the Army of the Potomac under McClellan grew from 50,000 in July of 1862 to 168,000 in November. So there are a lot more volunteers, there are a lot more men coming in because a lot of the men wanted to serve under someone like McClellan and they wanted to fight for their country. There was a morale here that he brought that was not there before. So he more than doubled the size of the Army of the Potomac at that time. And, under his leadership, the army grew, confidence grew, and the Army of the Potomac became the primary Union force in the Eastern Theater. And McClellan's organizational legacy endured long after his departure. So what he was able to create by getting this army in shape lasted throughout the war. This is every general who took up after him, and eventually Grant took after, became the commanding general in 1864. That was because of him, because he turned this army into what it became men that were able to be led instead of just being unorganized and undisciplined. So major campaigns and battles. So to to start this off, because he was a Union general, does not mean that McClellan was an abolitionist. He was not. He was not fighting for emancipation, and that led to a lot of criticism from the radical Republicans. And this lack is apathy towards slavery, towards what was happening to slaves, and the real reason we're fighting the Civil War leads to his conflict with Lincoln in 1864, which we will get to. But it's good to know that he was not fighting to free the slaves. He was fighting to preserve the Union, and there's a very big distinction in that. So, with that being said, McClellan led several major campaigns, most notably the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, in which he aimed to capture the the Confederate capital of Richmond. And this is where I mentioned earlier in the Mexican-American War sieges. He understood the value of siege, and Richmond, and not for the first time, will be held under siege. One of McClellan's biggest missteps came with Special Order number 191. And for those Civil War fans here, know exactly what that is. These were orders issued by Robert E. Lee in September 1862 during the Maryland campaign. And a discarded copy of these orders were found wrapped up in cigars and were recovered by the Union Army a little bit later. And eventually, these orders were given to McClellan. So McClellan did use some of this information. He he altered, his forces, he altered his movements, and defeated Lee at the Battle of Antietam. But given that he had a blueprint of what Robert E. Lee was going to do in his hands, he did not do enough. Many have argued that if he had persevered and fought, we might have ended the Civil War in 1862 instead of the war going on until 1865. And this is where a lot of his heavy criticisms came. One of the reasons why McClellan was slow to fight is that he had a paranoia in him, and it becomes very obvious later on. Despite his victory, despite having Lee's orders in his hands, and just happened to be dropped by Confederates, he was very paranoid and he did not pursue what he thought to be a possible trap. His paranoia got the best of him. He said, "Oh no, this could be a trap. Oh, Lee could lure my army out, and then he'll go for Washington D.C. and then attack the city." And he grossly overestimated his competition's capability. He overestimated how many men Lee had in his army. Lee was a very good general, and he divided his already small forces into beating a man who had more ammunition and more men. That's the difference between a commander like Lee and a commander like McClellan. You can give McClellan, you know, actual orders of what he was going to do, and he would still somehow find a way to fall short of that. And it would lead to great frustrations. And the Battle of Antietam became a very big tipping point in the war for several reasons. One, it was the bloodiest single battle day in the American Civil War. I believe 26,000 casualties. And I believe it was the first battle to really get photographed and get published. So you had men like Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady taking pictures of these dead bodies on Antietam. And it unleashes a whole new horror to people. Now, people knew the Civil War, they could understand, but now they're looking at pictures of dead bodies of both Northern and Southern soldiers in newspapers, and it hits home very, very differently. And yes, he won, but also at what cost? What's the point of all these men dying if you can't finish the job with orders that you have in your hand? And his cautious approach frustrated President Lincoln and other leaders to absolutely no end. Lincoln was at his wit's end with McClellan throughout their entire relationship. It was a very bad and very strained relationship. However, with the victory at Antietam, Lee's initial campaign into the North ended and Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So the one major good silver lining that came out of this battle is that with all that bloodshed of Antietam, Lincoln says we are going to emancipate the slaves. And now it's not just about reconciliation anymore. It's not about preserving the Union with or without slavery. In order for this war to end, the slaves have to be freed. So the major silver lining throughout that campaign. So leadership style and controversy. So McClellan was very meticulous. He was a good student. He wrote manuals. He understood logistics. He was very good at planning, and he was very cautious. But that was borderline indecisiveness, which is not a quality you need in a general to win a war. You cannot have a general in charge of hundreds of thousands of soldiers being very indecisive. So that was, I believe, his biggest flaw was his ability to be indecisive. And his paranoia came, and he frequently believed he was outnumbered. Always believed he was outnumbered. And that led to him delaying attacks and requesting more resources. And he wanted more men and he needed more guns. And Lincoln's like, I'm giving you everything I can. How much more do I have to give you before you move? I can only give you a certain amount of guns. What are you going to do with all this? And his cautiousness, resulted in several mischances to defeat the Confederate army. So again, this is a situation where it's debatable, but if McClellan had the guts that Grant had, would this war have ended, earlier? And it's obviously he didn't, and the war continued for, several years. And then he had a very fraught relationship with President Lincoln. He was incredibly disrespectful to Lincoln, both in front of him and behind his back. He basically participated in subordination against the commander in chief. He openly undermined President Lincoln. He would call him a guerrilla in front of his men. He would call him incompetent. He would ignore Lincoln when Lincoln would come to see him. And it was just a very bad relationship. There's a story where Lincoln and Secretary William S. Seward were waiting for McClellan at McClellan's home. McClellan was late. He was informed that they were there, but then went upstairs and, left Lincoln and Seward sitting in the living room. But that's the desperation that Lincoln had. He wanted to win this war. He was willing to accept that kind of disrespect from someone. McClellan wasn't embarrassed about that behavior, but the people in the house where the servants were, they were embarrassed as the President of the United States is sitting here waiting for a general, and the general just walks up the stairs and ignores him. That's the kind of relationship, and that's, in a way, the kind of man that McClellan was. You may even call him a narcissist. He was very intelligent, high functioning, very intelligent, but thought he was better than everyone, and didn't seem to have respect, for the chain of command because he thought he could, do better. And with McClellan's strained relationship with President Lincoln, just marked just disagreements over strategy, and there was a lack of communication, and this ultimately led to his removal from command in late 1862. And his leadership style remains a subject of debate among historians. Again, he was loved by the soldiers. He was loved by the public. He photographed well, but you can just even tell in this picture I have right here, it is a very intense picture. Lincoln is sitting there and McClellan is behind the desk. Who's the president here? It looks like McClellan is in command and not Lincoln. So there's a lot of tension and it just was not it was a bad situation. And a very famous quote from President Lincoln is, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." That's how bad it was. You have hundreds of thousands of soldiers. You have horses. You have guns. You have ammunition. You have rations. You have all of this. Please use it. But again, he was very slow to do anything like that. So after he is fired in 1862, McClellan leaves the army and he enters politics. So, most famously, he ran for president in 1864 against Lincoln. And for a time, it seemed like he was going to win. So, he was advocating for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. He would not abolish slavery. He would return the slaves back to the South and work for reconciliation. So, everything that had happened for the last several years, the Emancipation Proclamation, um, would just go away if McClellan had become president. So everything, all the bloodshed, everything Lincoln had worked for would just be gone. And McClellan was very popular, particularly among the soldiers who vote. And that was a very big worry because who is your loyalty to? A former commander that you have or the commander in chief in Lincoln? So, he was doing well in the polls. It really did seem like Lincoln was going to lose the election in 1865. But a big miracle happened. The success of Sherman's march to the sea and General Grant's leadership turned the tide of the war. And because Sherman was able to capture Atlanta and Savannah, Abraham Lincoln won re-election in 1864, and a big crisis was averted. So, at the conclusion of the war, in 1865, McClellan and his family went to Europe. It was a humiliating defeat for a man with as big an ego as McClellan to lose to Lincoln in 1864. Not only did he really see Lincoln as an enemy, he really undermined him at any chance he got while he was, the head of the Army of the Potomac. And it was very ugly and it was embarrassing. And so the war ended. Lincoln was assassinated and he just leaves. He goes back to Europe and does not return until 1868. And in this time period, he did not participate, in politics. He just wanted to take a break from all of that. He was under a lot of intense scrutiny, especially after Lincoln got assassinated and the death tolls that, people were finally learning about it. It was a lot of scrutiny, but eventually he did go back into politics. Um, he served as the governor of New Jersey from 1878 to 1881. And he was focusing on education and infrastructure, again, things that he knew really well. He was an instructor at West Point. He wanted to educate people, and then infrastructure. Again, he was a vice president, and he helped run railroad companies during his time out of the military. So he could use those skills to better the state. But his post-war years were just marked by public service, and he was writing his memoirs, but the and he was loved by some people, but support for him was mixed for the rest of his life, because now 10, 15, 20 years after the war, people are ranking generals. Who was a great general? Who was a bad general? Oh, Robert E. Lee is untouchable. Everything was Longstreet's fault. Oh no, everything's McClellan's fault. Grant never made a mistake in his life. A lot of these conversations are happening, and he finds himself under intense scrutiny, despite the fact the war had been over, for obviously more than a decade and a half at that point. But he tried to live more of a quiet life, and people wanted him to run for president because he still had popularity among a lot of the former, Union soldiers. But he stayed, just as a governor, a little bit more out of the spotlight. But he died very young. He died at the age of 58 in 1885 from a heart attack. And, he left behind two children who I believe never had children, so I don't think McClellan has any living descendants. Um, and in addition to not having living descendants, he left behind a very complex legacy, both as a military leader and as a public servant. He just remained controversial for the rest of his life. So, legacy and historical assessment. I like this photograph a lot. This is from the National Portrait Museum, and I think it captures McClellan later in his life very well. He's no longer the young Napoleon. He is an older man. You can see he's a little bit weathered in his eyes. There's a lot of pressure on him. He's not as confident maybe as he was before, but he still has that look of, the young Napoleon. So this quote that was published in McClellan's obituary from the New York Evening Post, which I believe might have become the New York Post later, says probably no soldier who did so little fighting has ever had his qualities as a commander so minutely, and we may add, so fiercely discussed. And I think that quote right there describes McClellan. He was commander for a very short period of time, but the death toll under him, the controversies under him, his bad relationship with Lincoln under him has him under a microscope well over 160 years after the man served. We're still talking about him today and his tactics today. So this is a very great quote because McClellan's legacy is still an ongoing debate. Did he do some things? Well, yes, of course. He created the Army of the Potomac. He had a very good analytical mind, but he did not have guts. He did not have what it took to finish the job. Was that his paranoia? In some cases, yes. Was that his fear of failure? Probably. Did he want to preserve his soldiers' lives? Absolutely. But you can't fight a war and not have any casualties. And a lot of nasty battles have happened under him, one of them being, the Battle of Antietam. So he's credited with building the Army of the Potomac, but he really is seen as honestly one of the worst generals that the Union had had. But his reluctance, to take risks and his contentious relationship with, civilian leadership, it limited his effectiveness as a battlefield commander. So had he maybe listened to Lincoln, maybe had he listened to the advice of some other generals, well, this had been different. If he had a better relationship with Lincoln, Lincoln was a smart man. Lincoln understood things. He was not formally educated like he was, but Lincoln, had some opinions, and how much better would things have been if that relationship, were better. Some historians view him as a brilliant organizer, but a flawed strategist. And that's true. You can organize something, but you can organize something to only a point. How are you going to implement it? And it's the second part, the implementation of his plans, of his strategies, of moving his armies, of taking risks. That's where he fell very short. But we have to agree his impact on military organization and his role in shaping the Union war effort remain significant aspects of his historical reputation. And even someone like Robert E. Lee saw him, as a formidable opponent. And Robert E. Lee doesn't was, one of the best generals in the Civil War, even though he was for the South. He was someone who took risks and, you know, had the admiration and appreciation of his men. So he's very much a way you can say like a doppelganger to McClellan, who was loved by his men but didn't take risks. So his legacy and his historical assessment are still up for debate, but he is a very complicated man. I think if we try to create him based off of what you've been told, he's such a villain, and in some ways he is. But his men loved him. He organized the army, and we're still talking about him. He did do some good, even though he was not the most effective general that the Union Army had. But I will say this, I enjoyed learning about him. I enjoyed having a deeper understanding of him, a little bit more of appreciation for his mind and what he did. But not everyone who goes to West Point is cut out to be a general, and he is a prime example of that. Someone who was not a great student was Grant. Grant was in the middle of his class. He was okay, but he was a brilliant military strategist and also took risks as well. So he, in a way, finished what McClellan has started. Thank you for coming. I hope people enjoyed it.
That's
Yeah.
good. No, it was fantastic. And thank you so much for taking your time and putting this together for us. That's you're a teacher at heart. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. God bless everybody. Everyone take care and enjoy the rest of your week and Merry Christmas and
Merry
happy
Christmas.
holidays.